Wolfgang Van Halen was born into a family that was really famous. His dad was Eddie Van Halen, one of the best guitar players ever. But while everyone watched his dad become super famous, Wolfgang was living his own story. What was his dad Eddie really like when no cameras were around? And why won't Wolfgang play any Van Halen songs after his dad died? This is the side of Wolfgang Van Halen that most people don't know about, and you might be surprised by what you learn. Growing up Van Halen, Wolfgang William Van Halen was born into a house that wasn't like most kids' houses. His dad was Eddie Van Halen, one of the most amazing rock guitar players in the whole world. And his mom was actress Valerie Bertinelli, a famous TV star that lots of people loved. Right from the start, Wolfgang's life was all about being famous, music, and having a last name that everyone knew. But behind all the fancy stuff of growing up in a famous family, Wolfgang's early years were filled with watching quietly, learning slowly, and being really close with his dad. This closeness would change everything about who he would become. Growing up, music wasn't just playing in the background. It was part of who he was. While most kids were still learning their ABC, Wolfgang was already learning about rock music beats and sounds. His dad Eddie wasn't just a guitar superstar at home. He was also someone who really loved music and believed in letting his son learn about instruments in a natural and fun way, just like he did. Eddie never made his son play music, but he made sure all the music stuff was there when Wolfgang felt like playing. This feeling came early, and when he was 9 years old, Wolfgang started playing drums. He didn't take fancy lessons or feel any pressure, he just played around and figured things out. On his 10th birthday, Eddie gave him his first real drum set. And that present was way more than just a gift. It was a quiet way for Dad to tell his son that music could be something they shared together. Wolfgang remembered later how Eddie would record song ideas on a tape recorder, and Wolfgang, who was barely a teenager, would try to copy them on drums. Those times were special and private between a dad and son who were talking to each other through rhythm and sound. While drumming was how he started, Wolfgang didn't stop there. Over time, he taught himself to play guitar, bass, and piano. This wasn't because he felt pressure or wanted to be as famous as his dad. Instead, it was because he just really loved music. He would often sit with instruments for hours, trying out different sounds, scales, and songs. He wasn't trying to be Eddie Van Halen. He was trying to be someone who respected his family's music history, but was quietly making his own sound in a house filled with guitar music and late-night music sessions. By the time he was a young teenager, it was clear that Wolfgang had not only gotten his dad's musical skills, he had also learned to be really good at hearing melodies and putting songs together. And in 2006, when he was just 15 years old, that natural talent led to something that would make people in the rock world pay attention. Wolfgang joined Van Halen as the band's new bass player, taking the place of longtime member Michael Anthony. It was a choice that made some people upset. Fans didn't know what to think about the band bringing in Eddie's teenage son, but people close to the family knew that it wasn't just because he was Eddie's son, it was because he had grown and gotten better. Wolfgang had spent years learning every song, watching every practice, and playing along by himself. He wasn't just familiar with the music. He felt connected to it emotionally. Getting the job in the band wasn't taking a shortcut. It was the result of quiet hard work and trust between dad and son. Going on tour with Van Halen was more than just a big career move for Wolfgang. As a teenager, he was going on stages in front of thousands of people, standing next to his dad and playing the bass parts of songs that had changed rock music forever. And yet, he did it with humility. People who didn't like the idea were surprised by how mature he was, and even fans who weren't sure at first quickly admitted that Wolfgang brought new energy to the band that was tight and really respectful of Van Halen's history. In 2012, Wolfgang's journey with the band reached another big moment with the release of A Different Kind of Truth. It was the first Van Halen studio album in over 14 years. His bass playing on the album was good, confident, and creative. He wasn't copying anyone. Instead, he was building bass lines that made the music better while still letting his dad's guitar be the main focus. For Wolfgang, this was never about being in the spotlight. It was always about making music with his dad. But while the crowds cheered and the band played loudly on stage, behind the scenes, life wasn't always easy. Wolfgang was watching his dad's health get worse slowly, sometimes where everyone could see. However, Eddie never let being sick stop his love for performing, especially not when he was sharing the stage with his son. Wolfgang talked in later interviews about how much those tours meant to both of them. Eddie wasn't just showing the world he could still play. He was spending special time with his son in the most meaningful way he knew how. They would fly together, eat together, practice, joke around, and then walk out under the lights together. Those weren't just shows. They were memories being made in real time while dealing with cancer treatments and knowing that time might be running out. In many ways, Wolfgang joining Van Halen was never about making the band popular again or trying to get younger fans. It was personal. It was a dad bringing his son into the world he had built, and a son stepping into that world, not to take it over, but to honor it. And through those years on tour and in the studio, Wolfgang wasn't just playing music. He was keeping track of his relationship with his dad in the most special way they both understood through sound. But behind the scenes, most fans never knew just how much Wolfgang had to help his dad through some of the hardest years of his life. Eddie's genius and struggles. Because behind the famous guitar riffs, the screaming solos, and the explosive energy that made him one of the most important guitarists in rock history, Eddie Van Halen was also a very complicated person. He was a person driven by being really smart about music, haunted by wanting everything to be perfect, and often pulled into the darker parts of his own mind and body. Eddie Van Halen didn't just play the guitar, he changed how it was played. His amazing use of something called the tapping technique, which means using both hands on the guitar neck to create fast, smooth, and almost magical bursts of notes, changed how guitar was played forever. It was more than just being creative. Before Eddie, guitar solos were just technical shows of skill. However, after Eddie, they became like sonic roller coasters. What made his style so exciting was that it wasn't about showing off. Eddie just wanted to explore. He once said he saw the guitar like a tool with no instruction manual, and every day he was finding new ways to use it. Whether it was a home-made guitar he called the Frankenstrat built from spare parts and duct tape, or the way he used volume knobs and harmonics to bend sound into something new, Eddie was always trying new things, pushing limits, and chasing something no one else could hear. One of the most famous moments in his career came in 1982, when he was asked to play the guitar solo on Michael Jackson's Beat It. Eddie walked into the studio, listened to the song a few times, and then played a solo that would go on to define an entire time period of pop and rock music mixed together. That solo wasn't about money or fame, because he already had both. It was about creating something unforgettable, and that was always Eddie's driving force. But the same fire that fed his genius also fed his problems. For much of his life, Eddie fought with addiction. Alcohol and illegal drugs became constant companions, sometimes numbing, fueling, and often controlling how his days and nights went. His addiction wasn't public-like in gossip magazines, but it had real impact on him. It lived behind closed doors, in studio sessions that went too long, or mornings that started too late. His bandmates noticed, and his family members were worried, but through it all, Eddie kept playing. In interviews over the years, Eddie spoke honestly, sometimes painfully, about how addiction had shaped him. He admitted that in the peak years of Van Halen's fame, he was often drunk on stage, not because he didn't care, but because he couldn't stop. The pressure of living up to the legend he had created was huge. He was constantly expected to deliver brilliance night after night, tour after tour, and wanting everything to be perfect became like a prison. Eddie wasn't just hard on himself, he was hard on others, too. Van Halen as a band was known for its internal fights, the revolving door of lead singers, the arguments about direction and the behind. The scene's drama often spilled into the public eye. But at the center of it all was Eddie, driven, focused, and often uncompromising. He demanded the best, not because he was arrogant, but because he believed the music deserved nothing less. But that perfectionism often clashed with the egos and personalities around him, leading to friction that would define much of the band's history. At home, those same struggles played out differently. As a father, Eddie was softer and more vulnerable. Wolfgang later shared how even during the worst periods of addiction, his dad never stopped being present for him. They would play together, eat together, and laugh together. But even Wolfgang admitted it wasn't always easy. There were times when his dad was deeply struggling, and times when the music took a backseat to the fog of addiction or the exhaustion of treatment. In the early 2000s, Eddie was told he had tongue cancer. He had surgery to remove part of his tongue, and for a while it seemed like the worst had passed, but health problems kept coming back. His hip got bad and needed surgery, and his energy went down. But still, he kept pushing, recording, and performing. Privately, Eddie was also dealing with severe worry about his health. He became withdrawn at times, staying out of the public eye, avoiding interviews, and going back to his studio, a place where he could still control what happened. However, for those closest to him, the signs were clear. Eddie was in pain, and not just physical pain, emotional pain, too. The kind that builds up over decades of pressure, mistakes, victories, and regret. Even in his final years, Eddie was recording constantly. He filled hard drives with unreleased music, ideas, riffs, and entire songs, waiting for the right moment to share them. Some say he knew he didn't have much time left, and he was racing against time to leave behind something meaningful. Not just for the fans, but for his son, Wolfgang, because at the heart of all this genius, all this struggle, was the bond between a father and his son. Wolfgang wasn't just a bandmate. He was Eddie's anchor, his reason to stay sober, his reason to keep going. And in many ways, Eddie saw in Wolfgang a second chance, not just for music, but for making things right. But Eddie's story isn't just about guitars and battles with addiction. It's also a story of love. The women who shaped his heart, the marriage that changed him, and the relationships that echoed through the music, he left behind the love that stayed around. For all the noise that surrounded Eddie Van Halen's life, from the concerts to the studio sessions, the public fights, and the personal battles, there was one constant thing that ran through it quietly but powerfully, and that was love. Eddie's most well-known relationship began in 1981 when he married actress Valerie Bertinelli, a rising star in Hollywood known for her role on the hit sitcom One Day at a Time. Their wedding was in headlines, and for a while they were seen as one of the industry's golden couples. Beneath the surface, their marriage was never a fairy tale. Fame, addiction, and distance took their toll. Still, out of that complicated marriage came something both of them treasured more than anything else. Their son, Wolfgang. Eddie named him after one of his musical heroes, Wolfgang Amadeus Mozart. It wasn't just a casual choice. Eddie held deep respect for classical music, especially the way Mozart could blend technical brilliance with emotional depth. In naming his son after the legendary composer, Eddie wasn't just honoring the past. He was setting a tone for the future. Music wasn't going to be something Wolfgang stumbled into. It was already woven into who he was from the moment he was born. As Wolfgang grew, the marriage between Eddie and Valerie began to break down. The pressures of Eddie's touring life, combined with his struggles with drug abuse, created emotional distance that couldn't be ignored. They separated in 2001 and officially divorced in 2007. But what's remarkable about their story is not how it ended, but how it continued. Even after the divorce, Eddie and Valerie remained close. Their bond as parents who raised their child together never wavered. They worked together to raise Wolfgang in a way that kept him grounded, supported, and loved. even as he stepped into one of the most high-pressure roles you can imagine. In interviews, Valerie often spoke of Eddie with a mix of tenderness and pain, admitting the ways they had hurt each other, but never questioning how deep their love had been. That emotional complexity came into full view after Eddie's death in 2020. Valerie posted a tribute that was as raw as it was revealing. She wrote, "Maybe next time we'll get it right." Those words carried a lifetime of meaning, regret, forgiveness, and hope. It was a public admission that despite everything, the love had never fully disappeared. It had just changed shape. Eddie found love again later in life. In 2009, he married Janie Liszewski, a publicist and former stuntwoman who brought a different kind of peace to his world. Their relationship was more private and settled. Janie stood by him through some of the toughest years of his health battles. While the chaos of the past never fully disappeared, Janie's presence seemed to offer Eddie a softer and more stable chapter where quiet dinners and slower mornings still mattered. For Wolfgang, watching his father's journey through love, heartbreak, and healing had a deep impact. He grew up seeing not just the highs of romantic connection, but also the complications. He saw the arguments, the making up, the struggles to communicate, and the efforts to raise a child together. He saw what it meant to try and to keep trying even when things didn't work out the way you planned. That emotional maturity carried into Wolfgang's own love life. In 2023, he married his longtime partner, Andrea Alsop, a software engineer who had been by his side for years through the loss of his father, the launch of his solo career, and the long process of stepping out from behind the Van Halen legacy. Their wedding was a private, intimate affair, but one gesture from that day stood out and spoke volumes. Wolfgang left an empty chair in honor of his father, Eddie. This was a powerful and deeply personal reminder that even though Eddie was gone, his presence was still felt. Wolfgang didn't have to say anything. That one empty chair said it all. Love for Wolfgang wasn't just about romance. It was about memory and about honoring what came before without letting it define what comes next. In many ways, he took the lessons from his parents' relationship and used them to build something stronger and more stable. He found a partner who didn't just understand the weight of his past, but who helped him carry it without being crushed by it. And in doing so, Wolfgang created space in his life not only for love, but also for healing. Although Eddie's relationships were complicated, they were also real, full of effort, flaws, forgiveness, and a quiet kind of loyalty that lasted longer than anyone expected. And now, as Wolfgang builds his own family, those lessons live on in the way he treats his wife. But when Eddie Van Halen's battle with cancer finally came to an end, Wolfgang wasn't just left with memories. He was left with silence, responsibility, and a sadness so deep it would take him years to find the words. How Eddie's passing impacted Wolfgang. On October 6, 2020, the world lost a guitar legend. But for Wolfgang Van Halen, that day meant something much more personal. It wasn't just the day the music stopped. It was the day he lost his father, his closest collaborator, and his biggest supporter. Eddie Van Halen died at the age of 65 after a long private battle with cancer. Officially, the cause was a stroke, but by then Eddie had already been through years of surgeries, treatments, and quiet suffering. According to Wolfgang, when the end came, he and his mother, Valerie Bertinelli, were right there by Eddie's side, holding his hand as he slipped away. For Wolfgang, those final moments were not just the end of a chapter. They were a deep turning point. In one moment, he lost the man who had taught him how to tune a guitar, how to be patient in the studio, and how to chase a melody until it made sense. But more than that, he lost the one person who never saw him as just Eddie Van Halen's son. In the months that followed, Wolfgang struggled to find solid ground. Publicly, he wrote a heartfelt statement where he said, "I've had so many dreams lately where Pop and I are just doing normal things, and then I realize it's a dream, stop whatever I'm doing and hug him for as long as I can until I wake up. He was the best father I could ever ask for. Every moment I've shared with him on and off stage was a gift." But privately, Wolfgang was wrecked. The grief was overwhelming, suffocating, and unfamiliar in its depth. He described it later as something that sat in the middle of his life and refused to leave. No matter what he did, it was always there, quietly swallowing joy and robbing him of the instinct to celebrate even his own achievements. Eddie had been cremated, and his ashes were given to Wolfgang. It was a deeply meaningful gesture that showed that Eddie hadn't just passed down a legacy of music. He had entrusted his son with his memory. Wolfgang chose to scatter his father's ashes off the coast of Malibu, near the water where Eddie had spent so many peaceful moments over the years. But grief didn't end with that moment. If anything, it deepened. And as the music world wondered about a Van Halen tribute concert or a possible reunion with guest performers, Wolfgang made a choice that surprised everyone. He refused to cover any Van Halen songs live. Speaking about his decision in an interview, he said, "Songwriting is a very therapeutic thing for me. I can get through things that I can't through talking or otherwise. That's a big reason why I don't ever want to play Van Halen songs, because I only want to play with my father, and he's not here to play it." To Wolfgang, playing his father's songs without his father didn't feel like a celebration. It felt like pretending the loss hadn't happened, and so the only way forward was to make something of his own. That decision led to the birth of Mammoth WVH, Wolfgang's solo project, named after the band Eddie had originally played in before Van Halen was formed. But this wasn't just a name from the past. It was a full circle moment. When speaking about the choice of his band's name in an interview, Wolfgang said, growing up, "I told my dad that when I had my own band, I'm calling it Mammoth, and here we are." Their first single, Distance, hit with emotional force. Released just a month after Eddie's death, the song was never meant to be part of an album. It was written during those final months of his father's life as a musical letter to the man he was slowly losing. The lyrics were raw and aching, but what truly elevated the song was its music video. It was a collection of home footage showing Eddie and Wolfgang over the years. Not backstage footage, not behind the scenes at concerts, but small, intimate moments of father and son having the best time of their lives. For fans, it was a rare look at Eddie Van Halen, not as a rock icon, but as a dad. And for Wolfgang, it was the only tribute that felt real. The song connected with people instantly, and it went viral. Distance earned Wolfgang his first Grammy nomination, a moment of recognition that under different circumstances might have been a celebration. But even then, Wolfgang said it felt strange and surreal, like it was happening in another life. Still, he kept going. His self-titled debut album, Mammoth WVH, was released in 2021, and it quickly earned respect across the music world. This was tight, thoughtful rock, full of catchy hooks, polished instrumentation, and lyrics that carried real emotional weight. Reviewers praised Wolfgang's songwriting as honest and surprisingly mature. There were no attempts to ride his father's coattails. Instead, he delivered solid songs and played with skill and heart. Even as he promoted the album, Wolfgang made it clear that his father's influence would always be present as a guide. He spoke about how Eddie had always encouraged him to follow his own path, to not worry about living up to the Van Halen name, and that permission gave Wolfgang the courage to say no to expectations and yes to authenticity. And that decision has continued to define him. With every performance, every interview, and every refusal to turn Mammoth into a tribute act, Wolfgang has shown that grief doesn't have to be loud to be powerful. Sometimes honoring someone means not copying them, but building something entirely new and letting their spirit live in the silence between the notes. Now, years after Eddie's passing, Wolfgang is still grieving. But just when fans thought they had seen the final goodbye, Wolfgang opened up about his father Eddie, and it's something no one expected, the tribute no one saw coming. For years, fans wondered what kind of grand tribute Wolfgang Van Halen would create to honor his father. A star-studded concert, a Van Halen reunion, or a cover album. But the truth is, the real tribute was already happening in a way that no one expected. In interviews, Wolfgang made it clear. "I think just doing what I do is enough of a reference and tribute. Just me existing and continuing to be my own person and my own musical space. I don't think people realize that me just doing that is enough of a tribute and respect towards the life that he gave me and the interests he put in me. At first, some people didn't understand what he meant, but those who were really listening knew exactly what he was saying. He didn't need to copy his father's music or live in his shadow to honor him. Every time he stepped on stage with his band, and every time he wrote a song that came from his own life, he was paying tribute in the most honest way possible. This approach confused some fans and even frustrated a few critics, especially when he refused to play Van Halen's songs live. But for Wolfgang, it was never about distancing himself from the past. It was about protecting what it meant. He knew that without his father, the music of Van Halen couldn't be the same, and trying to recreate it without Eddie would only feel empty. Wolfgang also found himself explaining statements that had been twisted online. At one point, a joke he made about Eddie ruining the '80s with his influence on guitar playing went viral, completely out of context. What he had meant as a playful observation about how many copycats flooded the scene after Eddie changed the game was turned into something harsh and misleading. Wolfgang quickly corrected the story, reminding people that no one respected Eddie Van Halen more than he did. It was just another example of the emotional tightrope he walks every day when he tries to honor his father while trying to have a voice of his own. The burden of carrying the Van Halen name has definitely taken its toll on Wolfgang. He has spoken openly about the pressure, the grief, and the constant comparisons, but he's also shown that he's strong enough to keep going, not by being the next Eddie, but by being the first Wolfgang. Through it all, he's leaned on family. In particular, he remains close to his uncle, Alex Van Halen, Eddie's brother, and Van Halen's drummer. Alex, who has remained largely out of the public eye since Eddie's passing, has been a quiet pillar of strength for Wolfgang, offering guidance, support, and a connection to the part of the family that still lives in the music. What's your favorite memory of Eddie Van Halen? Drop your answers in the comments section below. If you enjoyed this video, don't forget to click on the next video on your screen, like this video, and subscribe to our channel for more updates.